on AM 560 The Answer.
Chicago's Morning Answer continues next in our 1-hour heating and air conditioning weather center. Chilly day ahead, snow shower this morning, followed by a little more snow this afternoon possible. That could turn to rain with a high of 48. Currently, 35. Next news at 7. Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan and Amy continues next on AM 560, The Answer.
This hourly segment is brought to you by Retire Chicago. Tune in Saturday mornings at 8 to Retire Chicago with John McNamara of McNamara Capital.
Only the biggest stories, only the biggest guests, and only the biggest opinions. This is AM 560, The Answer.
Top of the morning, Dan and Amy, as we're talking about Illinois, the meth lab of the 50 laboratories of democracy in this country. California, in some respects, is better, and in some respects is substantially worse. Like they're reverting back to the dark ages, for example, would be one way they're worse at present. I mean, the rolling blackouts, 1.5 million Californians without power.
That's a big deal. I mean, imagine if that happened here. Why even bother? You're a customer. You should demand service, and that's a dangerous situation.
Why is this happening? Well, to help us get a handle on that, we're pleased to be joined by Chuck DeVore. He's the Vice President of National Initiatives at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, and if this isn't a commentary in and itself, a former California legislator. He has written on the topic. Chuck, thanks for being with us. Appreciate it.
Hey, great to be with you this morning.
I mean, I guess there's no more biting commentary than former California legislator now in Texas, but that tells you a lot about what's been going on in California, I suppose. But the PG&E and Gavin Newsom's effort to put this all on the power company, who is really to blame for the power crisis going on in California?
Well, this is the result of a little more than a decade of public policy. So this is regulators and elected officials telling these very heavily regulated public utilities. There's three big ones: PG&E, Southern Cal Edison, and San Diego Gas and Electric in the South. They've told them, look, you need to have a lot more renewable power. We want you to make a lot more wind power, a lot more solar power. And these companies only get paid for what they're authorized to charge the ratepayers. In other words, they're not like a regular company, right? Everything they get paid for, they have to ask permission. And so what we've seen is they make a lot of money on the wind and solar. They don't really make much money at all on power line maintenance and upgrades. In fact, a few years back, about 5 years ago, PG&E asked for $4.84 billion for power lines. A so-called consumer rights group fought them tooth and nail, and eventually they were granted a little less than half of that. So you wonder if they got what they asked for, maybe we wouldn't have had these fires that led to these preventative blackouts. And that's a whole different story, by the way.
Well, then Gavin Newsom, though, he believes this climate change is what's driving these deadly fires.
Right, so that's like the all-purpose excuse that is supposed to absolve the politician of any connection or responsibility with what's going on, right? I mean, it's like the dog ate my homework. And so here's the challenge, is that whether it's climate change or not, the solution to prevent the death and destruction is the same, which is start managing those dang forests. In Northern California, you have very extensive forest land that people tend to live in and among. A little more than half of that is managed by the federal government. A little less than half of that is managed by the state government and regulators. And so what you've seen over the last 20 years, ever since the spotted owl really became a big deal in the early 90s, is that the timber harvest has collapsed, especially on the federal lands. And as it's collapsed, you've had this huge buildup in fuel. You know, that funny thing happens. Every year the trees grow. And if you don't get in there and clear the underbrush and clear some of the higher tree density that is healthy, what's been happening is the trees have been dying off. California is prone to drought. It has nothing to do with global warming. It's just California. It's a Mediterranean climate. And as these trees are in higher density, they get stressed and they start to die off, and the bark beetles get in there and start to attack the trees. And then the environmentalists don't let you harvest the dead trees. They have to stay standing because, that's natural. So you have these useless matchsticks all over the state that very quickly lose any economic value as they just, stay upright. Eventually they fall over. And so Newsom is a little better than Jerry Brown. Jerry Brown really resisted a lot of these measures, only signed a couple of half measures into law in his last few months in office. Newsom at least seems to understand the problem when he thinks only Californians are listening, but when he's posturing for a national audience or attacking the president, he'll talk about global warming. But he did sign, I think it was 22 measures into law this last legislative session that should improve the process of clearing those forests. I think it's too little too late. We'll see. But at least he's taking baby steps in the right direction.
So interestingly, on that point, President Trump was right when he spoke out against the land management in California last year, and has been backed up by reports from organizations like the Little Hoover Commission suggesting the same thing, and that's sort of what you're describing as well. But the other point, though, too, I mean, just for those not familiar with the details, Californians are paying 50% more than the national average for power as it stands, including those 2 million people going without power.
Well, that's right, because, these policies have consequences. And when you have more of your grid powered by intermittent wind and solar, what eventually starts to happen is you have to pay more for the fossil fuel plants for the smaller amounts of time that they get to be used. And what's beginning to happen is California's higher costs are also being exported to the rest of the Western Interconnect, which is, roughly speaking, the western part of the United States, excluding Texas. So, that's a problem as well that's going to only grow and get worse. But the other challenge as well is in Southern California, you have what's known as the coastal chaparral, and that's really brush that's not particularly valuable in and of itself, but it grows and burns as well. It's part of its natural cycle. It needs to burn about every 20, 30 years. And what's been happening in the south and in the north, but particularly in the south, is when the fire marshals request permission to do a preventative burn, the air quality districts say, no, you can't do that. That might irritate some people's lungs, and then the environmental groups sue and say, well, a man-caused burn would be unnatural, and there's certain species in there. And so, again, what happens is the fuel load builds up, and then you get these fires, sometimes sparked by power lines, sometimes sparked by arson, sometimes sparked by, a car that's malfunctioned, and, the catalytic converter will start a fire. But however it starts, the fires are terribly bad because, again, we have not been clearing that brush. We have not been doing the preventative burns. And a lot of homeowners simply ignore admonitions to clear defensible space around their house. They like the way the trees and brush looks, and as a result, on a hot, dry day, their house ends up getting burned down.
And the response in part to this, what I think, fairly described as a crisis, is a series of new ballot initiatives for the November 2020 ballot in California. James Freeman writing about this in Wall Street Journal, including things like requiring manufacturers to make all plastic packaging and single-use foodware items recyclable or compostable by 2030, prohibiting food vendors from using styrofoam and other plastic foam takeout containers, and so on and so forth. So they're missing the forest for the trees, so to speak, aren't they, Chuck?
I see what you did there.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That's why you're on radio, man.
Yeah, right.
So yes, exactly. And so what you're going to see is there won't be any change at all. Now, here's the other challenge, right, is the politicians keep saying it's climate change. Let's talk about that for a moment and say, okay, you're 100% right. California is already a very energy-efficient state, partially, in fact, largely because of its nice climate. People just don't have to use their air conditioning or the heating much there. That's one of the reasons why people move there. So if you look at China, 7 months worth of economic growth in China, if you can believe their own growth projections, which are dubious, they are communists, 7 months worth of growth in China would wipe out the entire state of California. In other words, if you could just eliminate California tomorrow, it would be made up for by 7 months worth of economic growth in China as far as CO2 emissions. Now, here's why that's a problem. California used to make a lot of stuff. It makes less stuff. Where do they get the stuff they want? Well, they get it from China, maybe some from Texas. How do you get it there? Oh, you have to emit carbon dioxide to ship it there by airplane or boat. So is the planet really having less carbon dioxide emitted because of California's policies? I'd argue no. And in fact, there's a new study that was commissioned by the legislature in 2010 that shows that in the federal forests, the federally managed forests in California, those are now net CO2 positive because of all the fires that are going on. In fact, last year in California, the fires emitted about 10% of the state's CO2 emissions. Now, those aren't counted, right? When the bureaucrats count up the CO2 emissions to pat themselves on the back for the great job California's done, they don't include that 10%, the 45 million metric tons of CO2 from last year's fires.
All right. I love the article you wrote for foxbusiness.com. I was just reading it about why you left California for Texas and you have no regrets. What is life like in Texas with low taxes and a state that has a balanced budget?
Well, now you better be careful because some of your listeners are going to be following me down here. They're going to head south from Chicago and they're going to move down with me.
That's going to happen
regardless.
I
mean,
yes.
They love freedom.
Yeah.
You know, they love freedom. They're friendly. You have government less likely to tell you what to do. And so as a result, heck, I have a lot of neighbors down here that have moved over from California, including a few that I used to represent in the legislature, which is kind of odd. It's like, hey, don't I know you? so it's pretty amazing.
Chuck, leave a light on for us in Texas, will you? Chuck DeVore.
Yeah, and we'll have lights too.
Exactly, Chuck
Hey.
DeVore, because you're able to. Chuck DeVore is the Vice President of National Initiatives at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, former California legislator. Check out his piece in the Federalist on the California power crisis. I'll tweet that out as well. Chuck, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.